Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be breaking down the trade deadline. We just saw that Bo Horvat got traded to the Islanders in a massive deal, and the dominoes are surely beginning to fall. This deadline is super exciting because there are some massive names on the market, and we are going to be talking about all the rumors involving those players. We'll also be talking about how those potential trades could impact those players' fantasy value for the rest of the season, and in turn affect your fantasy teams. So let's dive right into it, guys. First, let's talk about Bo Horvat to the Islanders. Huge deal. Personally, didn't love the trade for the Islanders. I don't really understand why they would do that, but that's besides the point. What really matters to us fantasy hockey heads is how does this trade affect Horvat's fantasy value? I'm going to be honest, when I was writing the script for this video, before Horvat got traded, I was going to tell you guys to sell high on Horvat because there was the risk that Horvat was going to get traded to a team that is less goal scoring oriented, and the Islanders do not score a lot of goals. Even though it's a winning situation for Horvat, the Canucks right now score more goals per game than the Islanders, so that probably is going to impact his production. Horvat currently has 31 goals and a total of 54 points in 49 games, and that goal total puts him on pace for 51 goals in a full season. I don't really know if he is going to keep up this pace, being on a new team, being in a new system, new line mates, new coach. There's just so many variables to consider, and that's why I just don't love this for his fantasy value. Overall, I don't love Horvat for the rest of the season, but he has shown this year through 49 games that he can score a lot of goals on a pretty bad Canucks team. So cross your fingers and maybe hope that the Isles trade for a star winger, maybe a guy like Tarasenko who can play alongside Horvat. That would definitely help his situation, but in general, don't love it. Maybe I'm wrong. Moving on to players that have not been traded yet, let's start off with Thatcher Demko of the Vancouver Canucks, because he was in the news today. Elliotte Friedman was talking about how he would never have thought that Demko would be traded at the beginning of the season, but now with the way that things are going, he thinks it is a real possibility, and he mentioned teams like the Los Angeles Kane, the Buffalo Sabres, and the Pittsburgh Penguins potentially being interested in Demko. Obviously, Demko this year has been super disappointing with a record of 3-10-2, a horrible 3.93 goals against average, and a .883 save percentage. He's been out with an injury for almost 2 months now, an injury that had an original timeline of 6 weeks. So this will certainly impact a potential trade involving Demko. Obviously, with the Canucks trading their best player away and potentially even making more moves, they are going full tank mode. And this means that Demko's fantasy outlook, if he stays on the Canucks, is not very good. However, if he does get traded, this could be a huge boost to his fantasy value. I think the team that is most likely going to trade for Demko is the Los Angeles Kings. Their current starting goaltender is Phoenix Copley, a guy that has been a career backup, a career AHLer, and they have Jonathan Quick backing up him, who is 36 years old, and he has played absolutely terrible. I really don't think the Sabres are going to trade for Demko, because if they want to fix their goaltending situation, they could just do this in the offseason. The last thing we have on here is the Pittsburgh Penguins, and this is an interesting one because they do have a starting goalie in Tristan Jarry, but he's been an absolute band-aid this year. So if he goes down and they are in the playoffs, they need a goalie that is going to be better than Casey DeSmith. I just think Demko to the Kings makes a lot of sense, way more sense than the Pens or the Sabres. So we will see what happens. It is definitely going to be an interesting situation. The next player we're talking about is Jakob Chychrun of the Arizona Coyotes, a guy that's been on the trade market for what feels like 2 years now. It's been so drawn out, so many rumors, so many teams linked to him, and nothing has come of it, but maybe he finally gets traded this year. I think a large part as to why Chychrun hasn't been moved is because of his extensive injury history, and he missed the start of the season this year due to some injuries that he had. Since coming back, he has played extremely well. He has 25 points in 34 games, and he's also a +6 on a bottom of the barrel Coyotes team. After the season, Chychrun is still going to be on the books for another 2 years, and his contract is extremely cheap right now. I think it's like $4.6 million in terms of the cap hit for next season. We just got a report from Elliotte Friedman that the Islanders GM Lou Lamoriello said that the asking price for Chychrun was insane, and I really don't think they are going to move that price. Chychrun requested a trade out of Arizona, and there are no reports to suggest that he has rescinded this trade request, which means the Coyotes are going to have to move him at some point. if teams are not willing to meet the asking price of 2 first-round picks and a pretty decent prospect, then the Coyotes might have to lower this before they lose more value. The teams that have been linked to Chychrun are the Los Angeles Kings, the Ottawa Senators, the Minnesota Wild, the New York Islanders, the Buffalo Sabres, the Boston Bruins, the Edmonton Oilers, and the Florida Panthers. I think the Los Angeles Kings would be a really good trade destination for him. They really need help on defense. They got a young, really talented team. Chychrun would certainly help them a lot. The Ottawa Senators made more sense going into the season, but because they're not the best team, they're not making a push for the playoffs or the Stanley Cup, then it might not make the most sense. However, apparently Chychrun wanted to go to the Senators in the offseason, so this trade could still happen. Another team that makes a lot of sense is the Buffalo Sabres. They need help on defense. They got a really good young team. They are just outside the cusp of the playoffs this year. I think with Chychrun, having him under contract for the next 2 years, they can be competing within those next 2 years and then eventually sign him to a long-term deal with the amount of cap space that they have. So I really like the Sabres trading for him, but it's been kind of quiet in terms of their interest, so we will see what happens. For the most part, these other teams make sense too. I really don't think he's going to the Oilers. They are not going to match that asking price, but nonetheless, regardless of what team he gets traded to, it is going to help his fantasy value massively if he does get traded. Even now on the Coyotes, he is playing good. He is fantasy relevant. His peripherals are insane. 25 points in 34 games for a defenseman is really good. Just imagine him on a playoff team. Do I think he's going to get traded before the trade deadline? Probably not. I think it's going to be an off-season trade, unfortunately. Maybe a team will get desperate, but I think teams are likely not going to want to give up this much mid-season, and they are going to come back to it, reevaluate in the off-season. So if you own Chychrun, I wouldn't get your hopes up, but if he does get traded, I think he is going to be a top 3 fantasy defenseman for the rest of the season. So cross your fingers and hope it works out. Now let's talk about Timo Meier of the San Jose Sharks, who has been an absolute beast this year with 48 points in 51 games and also 28 goals. He had a breakout season last year and he's even improved upon those numbers. He is now on pace for 45 goals in a full season, and if your league counts shots and hits, he is likely a top 15 fantasy player. The 2 teams that have been linked to Timo the most are the New Jersey Devils and the New York Rangers, and I think this would be absolutely incredible for his fantasy value. Obviously, his value is still super high on the Sharks, and I don't know how much better he can get, but you got to think about the type of players that he would be playing alongside. Nico Hischier, Jack Hughes. With the Devils, playing on the first line power play. And with the Rangers, he would be playing alongside Artemi Panarin and Mika Zibanejad. He would have some massive nights playing on these 2 teams. I have no doubt about that. You also have the Sabres and the Islanders in the mix. I think if Timo has told the Sharks management that he is not going to re-sign with them in the offseason, then there's a very good chance that he gets traded. They don't want to lose him for nothing. If he's already a point per game player on the Sharks, how good is he going to be on the Rangers or the Devils? I think there's a very good chance that he gets traded to either one of these teams, so keep an eye out, and Timo owners, you should be really excited if he does. The next player we're talking about is John Klingberg of the Anaheim Ducks, who has 17 points in 42 games and is a minus 26 on the season. He has played terrible. It's clear that the Ducks signed him to a 1-year, $7 million contract in the offseason to flip him in the future before the trade deadline. He has been linked to 2 teams specifically that I've seen, the Seattle Kraken and the Edmonton Oilers. I don't think the Oilers need another offensive defenseman, but you never know with their management. I'm certain there are other teams that have called about Klingberg, but they haven't been reported yet, so that remains to be seen. We will see how that develops. Overall, I do think he is going to get traded, and if he goes to any other team, it will help his fantasy value. He's definitely not going to a team that's out of the playoffs. He is going to go to a contender. If you're still holding on to Klingberg, I suggest you do it for a little bit longer. If he does get moved, I think he's going to be a pretty solid fantasy defenseman, probably better than anyone on your waiver wire right now, so keep an eye out for that, and hopefully he can get traded to help your team. Another Arizona Coyotes defenseman that could be on the move before the trade deadline is Shayne Gostisbehere. Last year he had 51 points in 82 games, also a total of 14 goals, and this year he has been pretty solid. Not as good as last year, but he's kind of on a similar pace to hit 45 to 50 points with 29 points in 48 games and also 9 goals, so he's still scoring a lot of goals. In general, I think he's still a really solid player, but the main issue is that he just got injured last week and is going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. If you look at the timeline to the trade deadline, that puts him right around that period. So really not good for his trade value. We haven't heard many teams that have been linked to Gostisbehere. We have heard the Oilers potentially interested. There was a report that the Oilers called on a potential Gostisbehere and Nick Bjugstad trade. So keep an eye out for that if the Oilers decide to pull the trigger, but we will see what happens with his injury if he comes back earlier than expected. Now, with that being said, if Gostisbehere does get traded, it's going to be to a contender, a playoff team, and what that means is he is going to be a much better fantasy player than he currently is. I'm sure in a lot of your leagues, Gostisbehere is on the waiver wire right now. He was kind of struggling before he got injured, and now he's out for 4 to 6 weeks. So keep an eye on him on the wire if trade talks heat up, or if you have him on your team and he's on your IR, maybe hold on to him too. Like I said, if he gets traded, it could be huge. The next player we're talking about is Canucks forward Brock Boeser. He has struggled mightily this year. He only has 30 points in 41 games and also only 9 goals, putting him on pace for 18 goals in a full season. I think it's pretty obvious that his fantasy value will increase if he gets traded to a team, because any team that he's going to get traded to is going to be a playoff team that's looking to add some forward depth. However, I am not the highest on Boeser just because of his performance lately. Watching a few of the Canucks games, he looks slow at their skating. He just doesn't look motivated, but maybe that will change if he's on a better team. Some of these teams that have been linked to Boeser are the New Jersey Devils, the Minnesota Wild, the New York Islanders, and the Washington Capitals. I think these teams would be great for Boeser. He would slot pretty good in these teams' top 6. And if he can find that magic that he had in the last couple of seasons when he was a 25+ goal scorer, then of course he could be a pretty valuable fantasy asset. Keep an eye out for him if he's on your wire. Maybe make an ad for him a week or 2 before the trade deadline. I don't think people are going to be super crazy about Boeser in fantasy until he can show that he can actually score goals. We will see what happens on that new team, and hopefully he can bounce back. The next player we're talking about is Ryan O'Reilly of the St. Louis Blues. He has played absolutely terrible this year with only 16 points in 37 games, and he is also a whopping -28. O'Reilly's whole time with the Blues has been great. He's played fantastic, so I don't know exactly what is going wrong. I mean, pretty much everyone on the Blues is struggling except for a few select players. I just think he needs to change the scenery at this point. There's a few teams that O'Reilly has been linked to: the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Carolina Hurricanes, the New York Rangers, the Seattle Kraken, and I think any of these teams would be way better for his fantasy value than it currently is on the Blues. There are some issues like with him going to the Leafs, he would be on their 3rd line. He wouldn't see first line power play time. I think that's the main issue with O'Reilly, is that because he's getting traded to a contender, he's likely going to have a more depth role playing on a 3rd line. I think it's going to be better than what he's doing on the Blues right now, but I wouldn't be rushing to pick him up if he does get traded to the Leafs, the Canes, or Rangers. I just don't think that it's going to be a situation that provides your fantasy teams with a lot of benefit, but you never know. I've been wrong before. I would definitely keep an eye on him in some deeper leagues. I think he could be a really good option if he does get moved to a playoff team. But for now, just see how it plays out and hope that he bounces back no matter what team he's on. The next player we're talking about is Vladimir Tarasenko of the St. Louis Blues, a guy that has been a part of trade talks for almost 2 years now, dating back to 2021 when he initially requested a trade from the Blues. He felt that the Blues mishandled the injuries that he had to his shoulder, a shoulder in which he had to have 3 surgeries on in a span of 28 months. The Blues ended up not trading him last year, and he put up a career number of points with 82 points in 77 games, also potting in 34 goals. Unfortunately, this year it is not quite the same. This year he only has 29 points in 38 games and only 10 goals. He's also a -18 on the season, and if you look at Tarasenko's career numbers, he's been a consistent 30+ goal scorer in this league, so this has been a super disappointing year for him. To my knowledge, there is no report that he ever rescinded this trade request. He still wants out of the Blues, and it's likely that he is going to get his wish because he is going to be an unrestricted free agent in the offseason. It makes no sense for the Blues to just let him walk and gain nothing for it, so I think it is very likely that he will be traded before the trade deadline. Some of the teams that have been linked to Tarasenko include the New Jersey Devils, the New York Rangers, the New York Islanders, the Carolina Hurricanes, and also the Washington Capitals. I think Tarasenko getting traded to any of these teams is going to be an upgrade to his fantasy value. I've been hearing a lot about the Devils having interest in him, which I think would be great because the Devils have been scoring a lot of goals this year. Him slotting in on that top 6, potentially playing with Jack Hughes, could be massive. The fact is, he just had a career year last year and he's only 31 years old, so I do expect him to start scoring a lot of goals if he gets traded to one of these teams. Overall, I do think he's going to get traded. I do think it will help his fantasy value if he does get traded, and I think he's a great buy low target if you want to trade for him. If you're holding on to him, cross your fingers that he does get moved, because I think his fantasy value is going to be way better when he's on a new team. The last player we're talking about today is Patrick Kane of the Chicago Blackhawks. The Blackhawks are one of the worst teams in the league, if not the worst team, and they are certainly going to be in the running for Connor Bedard in this upcoming draft. Unfortunately, that has definitely affected Kane's production. He only has 34 points in 45 games and also only 9 goals. He's also a minus 26, so if your league values plus minus, I definitely feel for you. And I just feel for everybody that drafted Kane, because I don't think anyone expected him to be this bad. Just look at the Blackhawks last year. They were still one of the worst teams in the league, and yet Kane put up 92 points in 78 games. Yes, he's 34 years old and he's out of his prime, but the fact is that he put up 92 points last year as a 33-year-old, and he's still a really good hockey player. If he gets moved, he is going to get moved to a contender, and this means that his fantasy value could skyrocket. Kane's contract expires at the end of the season, so he will be an unrestricted free agent. I doubt the Blackhawks want to lose Kane for nothing, which means that I think there's a high possibility that he gets moved. The main issue is that apparently the Blackhawks asking price for Kane is really high. I've heard in a potential Rangers deal that they want Kakko or Lafreniere and a first, which is just like insane to me. I don't think a playoff team should be paying that much for a rental, a guy that is 34 years old. It just doesn't make any sense. However, maybe their asking price will come down as the trade deadline gets closer. So let's look at some of the teams that are linked. We have the Rangers, like I said. We have the Canes, who just lost Pacioretty and they have the cap space. We have the Pens, we have the Islanders, we have the Bruins, we have the Leafs, we have the Oilers. Some really high caliber teams. And yeah, like I said, if he does get moved, this is going to boost his fantasy production so much. It is really going to help your team. So if you own Kane, cross your fingers that does happen. And maybe if you don't have Kane on your team and you're thinking about trading for him, you make a deal in the next couple of weeks before trade talks really start heating up. That's pretty much it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you hit that subscribe button below, and like always, have a good one.